Sometimes the loudest noise in our lives isn't coming from the world around us, it's coming from within. The pressure to meet expectations, to be accepted, to constantly prove ourselves. It creeps into our thoughts when things go quiet. And in those quiet moments we start doubting, second-guessing, comparing. The truth is we lose ourselves not in big dramatic failures, but in small, invisible compromises. We forget who we are, trying to be everything for everyone else. But here's what the Buddha taught that changed everything for me. Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. And when you really sit with that, you realize the key to a life that feels light, free, and meaningful isn't out there, it's inside. In today's video, we're diving deep into Buddhist wisdom that teaches you how to gently shift your focus away from the noise and bring it back to the one person you've probably been neglecting the most, yourself. This isn't about selfishness. It's about self-return. It's about building a calm, unshakable center in a world that constantly pulls you in 100 directions. So if you're feeling stretched thin, emotionally exhausted, or quietly disconnected from your own path, please stay with me. Don't skip around. Every part of this video is carefully crafted to guide you back to your center. And if what we talk about here resonates with you, if it brings a little more clarity, calm, or perspective to your day, there's one simple, free way to support what we're doing here. Just tap the subscribe button. It might seem small, but it helps this message reach others who need it too. Let's begin this journey together. Not toward becoming someone new, but toward returning to who you've always been beneath the noise. There's a quiet illusion many of us live under, the idea that happiness is something we can earn, chase, or be given by someone else. From a young age, we start to believe that our peace depends on what others think of us, whether it's a compliment from a friend, a promotion at work, a text from someone we care about, or applause from strangers. We start giving our emotional well-being away, piece by piece. And then we wonder why we feel so unstable, why a single word can make or break our day. The Buddha, in his deep wisdom, pointed to a radically different truth. Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. At first, that sounds poetic, but when you start to live by it, everything begins to change. Think about how much of your energy goes into trying to feel okay. We try to be agreeable, likable, successful, presentable. We try to keep others happy, hoping that somehow it will bring us peace too. But that peace never lasts, because the moment someone disapproves or something doesn't go the way we planned, we're thrown off again. It's exhausting. We're constantly adjusting who we are just to feel stable. But the teachings of the Buddha don't ask us to perform for peace. They ask us to look inward for it. Because when your happiness depends on someone else's behavior, you're not free. You're tied to something you can't control. Let's say someone praises you, you feel good. But what happens when that same person criticizes you the next day? That joy you felt? It's gone. You're hurt, confused, maybe even angry. That's the danger of external validation. It's temporary. The Buddha taught that everything external is impermanent. It changes. It fades. And if your happiness is tied to something that constantly shifts, then your peace will always feel like sand slipping through your fingers. But inner peace? That's something no one can take from you. It doesn't depend on the circumstances. It doesn't depend on someone else's approval. It lives quietly inside you, waiting to be remembered. Self-reliance in Buddhism doesn't mean isolating yourself or not caring about others. It means becoming your own emotional anchor. It means sitting with yourself, listening deeply to your thoughts and feelings, and learning how to comfort, validate, and uplift yourself without needing someone else to do it first. That's what meditation teaches us. When you sit with your breath, with no distractions, you begin to notice how noisy your mind is. You see the cravings, the fears, the constant need for reassurance. But over time, as your awareness deepens, you begin to detach. not from people, but from the idea that they owe you happiness. And in that detachment, you find a kind of freedom that no one can give you and no one can take away. There's something profoundly misunderstood about being alone. For many people, solitude feels like a punishment, like something to escape. We're raised in a world that equates presence with value, where being surrounded by others, being busy, being constantly in motion, is seen as proof that we're doing something right. And so, the moment life slows down, the moment the noise fades and no one is around, panic creeps in. We rush to fill the silence with notifications, conversations, distractions, anything to avoid sitting with ourselves. But here's a perspective Buddhism offers that completely reframes this. Solitude isn't emptiness. It's sacred space, not something to fear, but something to embrace. The Buddha often withdrew into solitude, not because he didn't value connection with others, but because he deeply understood the importance of connection with oneself. He said, meditate, live purely, be quiet, do your work with mastery. There's something in that stillness that reveals truths you can't hear when the world is too loud. When you're alone, without distractions, your mind stops performing. It starts showing you what's really going on beneath the surface, what you're holding on to, what's draining you, what's calling to be healed. And that level of honesty, it can only rise in silence. That's why Buddhist monks spend weeks, sometimes months in retreat. It's not avoidance, it's realignment. When you learn to be at ease in your own company, something shifts inside you. You stop chasing people who don't value your presence. You stop looking for approval in the eyes of others. And you stop fearing moments of quiet because they no longer feel like a void, they feel like a home. Think about it. If you can't be peaceful with yourself, how can you be truly peaceful with others? We often expect relationships to complete us, to validate us, to distract us from our own discomfort. But relationships built on fear of solitude usually end up breeding even more loneliness. You're not really connecting, you're just trying not to be alone. Solitude teaches you to become whole again, not in a distant, disconnected way, but in a deeply grounded, loving way. When you sit quietly with yourself without judgment, without needing to fix or achieve or impress, you start to see yourself more clearly. You begin to realize that your worth doesn't depend on how others see you, that your peace doesn't come from their texts, their attention, their praise. It comes from within, from that deep breath you take when the world quiets down and you realize you're okay, you're still here, and you're stronger than you thought. The practice of sitting alone, even for 10 minutes a day, becomes a form of spiritual nourishment. In Buddhism, this is why meditation is so central, not just to calm the mind, but to see the mind, to observe the endless flow of thoughts, to understand the patterns, to create space between you and your reactions. When you learn to observe your mind in stillness, you gain power over it. You stop being dragged by your emotions, your fears, your impulses, and instead, you begin to choose. You respond instead of react. You move through life from a place of awareness, not autopilot. There's something we rarely talk about, but many of us carry it every day. The need to be seen, to be validated, to be told we're doing okay. Maybe it started when you were young, waiting for someone to notice your effort. Maybe it grew as you got older, as life got noisier, and you began to measure your worth by how people responded to you. A compliment would lift your mood. A cold look or no reaction at all. It could ruin your whole day. And before you knew it, you weren't living for your own peace anymore. You were living for approval. That quiet addiction to being liked, praised, acknowledged. But here's what the Buddha teaches us so gently and powerfully. The love and validation you're looking for, it's not out there. It's already within you. You've just been taught to look in the wrong direction. In Buddhist philosophy, There is a profound focus on inner self-reliance. The Buddha once said, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." It sounds simple, but it's revolutionary if you truly live by it. Because most of us are so conditioned to look outward for cues on how we should feel about ourselves. We wait for someone to tell us we're good enough before we believe it. But the truth is, every time you look to someone else to define your worth, you hand over your peace. And most of the time, the people we seek approval from, well, they're too busy chasing approval themselves to offer it to us in a meaningful way. Let's talk about what this actually looks like. You post something online and wait for the likes. You do something kind for someone and secretly hope they'll acknowledge it. You dress a certain way, say the right things, adjust your energy just to fit into a room. And maybe it works for a while. But what happens when the applause stops? What happens when no one notices? You start doubting yourself. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you built your self-worth on shaky ground. Buddhism invites us to come back to something steadier. Instead of being pulled by the shifting winds of people's opinions, we root ourselves in what the Buddha called right view, a clear, honest understanding of ourselves and the nature of life. Approval is impermanent, praise is conditional, and depending on them for happiness is like trying to build a house on a foundation of sand. You deserve better than that. So how do you break the habit? How do you stop seeking approval without becoming closed off or indifferent? You start by noticing when you're doing it. That moment when you hold your breath after sharing something, hoping it lands well. That moment when you're tempted to explain yourself just to be understood. Catch those moments, not with shame, but with awareness, and gently bring your focus back inward. Ask yourself, do I approve of this? Is this aligned with my values? Did I show up with integrity? The more you strengthen that inner compass, the less power outside opinions will have over you. It's not about ignoring people or shutting down emotionally. It's about remembering that your self-worth was never meant to be outsourced. And as that inner clarity grows, something beautiful happens. You begin to live with more freedom. You speak your truth more calmly. You make decisions more confidently. And perhaps most importantly, you start to rest, truly resting, because you're no longer performing for a world that changes its mind every 5 minutes. Sometimes something doesn't work out, and even though we try to be logical, stay calm and move on, a small part of us still aches. Whether it's not getting the job we really wanted, being turned away by someone we cared for, or hearing a no when we were hoping for a yes, rejection leaves a mark. Not because we're weak, but because we're human. And that little voice inside often starts whispering, maybe I'm not enough. Maybe something is wrong with me. But what if that voice wasn't telling you the truth? What if rejection wasn't a punishment at all, but a kind of redirection? A way the universe clears a path for something more aligned with your growth? In Buddhist wisdom, one of the most powerful teachings is impermanence, the idea that everything changes. Emotions, opportunities, relationships, they all rise and fall like waves. The Buddha reminded us that clinging, whether to people, outcomes, or the need to be accepted, is what causes suffering. It's not the rejection itself that breaks us, it's the story we attach to it. We think it means we're unworthy, that we've failed, that we need to work harder to be loved or respected. But in truth, rejection simply means something wasn't meant for us, not in this moment, not in this form. I once heard a monk say, sometimes the door closes, not because you're unworthy, but because you're being guided to knock somewhere else. That hit me deeply, because we often chase things not because they nourish us, but because they satisfy our ego. We want the validation, the title, the security. But Buddhism teaches us to ask a deeper question. Does this path support my liberation, my peace, my inner freedom? If the answer is no, then rejection isn't something to mourn, it's something to bow to. It's the world whispering, this is not the way. but there is another one. Letting go gracefully is one of the hardest but most freeing acts of wisdom. We often think we need closure, an explanation, something that makes it all make sense. But the Buddha taught that letting go doesn't always come with answers. It comes with acceptance. When we release the need to control the narrative or change someone's mind, we open the space for something far greater: stillness, clarity, alignment. It's okay to feel the sting. That's part of the experience. The goal is not to become numb or indifferent. It's to stay soft, even when things don't go your way. To feel the hurt, but not let it define you. To grieve the door that closed, but also to trust that it wasn't the only door. The Buddha once said, "In the end, only 3 things matter: how much you loved, how gently you lived, and how gracefully you let go of things not meant for you." May that wisdom carry you forward, not just when things go your way, but especially when they don't. There's something most people won't admit, but deep down, many of us are quietly imprisoned by one simple fear. What will they think of me? It doesn't matter how old you are or how much you've accomplished. This fear still whispers in the background. It shapes how we speak, how we dress, how we make decisions. We hesitate to post something online. We second-guess our choices. We replay conversations in our heads. Not because we've done something wrong, but because we're afraid someone else might not approve. And over time, that fear doesn't just take moments from us. It takes our authenticity, our joy, our peace. But Buddhism teaches us a radically different way to live, one that doesn't require anyone's approval to feel whole. The Buddha offered a timeless truth that speaks directly to this struggle. He said, "Let none find fault with others. Let none see the omissions and commissions of others, but let one see one's own acts, done and undone." That simple line carries a powerful message. Our energy is better spent observing our own growth than trying to manage how others perceive us. When we obsess over what others think, we're handing them a power they never asked for and probably don't even want. And here's the thing most people forget. People's opinions are often reflections of their own inner world, not yours. Their judgments, their criticisms, even their praise. It all comes through the lens of their own fears, expectations, and conditioning. So why let that dictate your self-worth? Think about how often you've felt held back, not because something was actually stopping you, but because you were afraid someone might misunderstand you. Maybe you didn't speak up in a meeting. Maybe you didn't go after something you really wanted. Maybe you silenced your voice, your creativity, your truth. Not because it wasn't valid, but because you were trying to avoid judgment. But here's a truth worth holding on to. People are going to judge you no matter what you do. You could stay quiet and someone will call you weak. You could speak your mind and someone will call you arrogant. You could play it safe and still be criticized. So if judgment is inevitable, you might as well be judged for living a life that's true to you. Buddhism teaches the concept of non-attachment, and this applies to how we relate to other people's opinions. Non-attachment doesn't mean we stop caring. It means we stop clinging. We stop letting outside approval determine our inside peace. The more you practice letting go of what others think, the lighter you feel. You realize that freedom isn't found in controlling how others see you. It's found in letting them see whatever they want, while you remain rooted in your truth. This doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual shift. You start by catching yourself when you feel the need to explain, justify, or alter who you are just to please someone. And in that moment, you pause, you breathe. You remember that your worth doesn't come from being understood by everyone. It comes from understanding yourself. You start showing up more honestly. You speak your truth even if your voice shakes. You make decisions that align with your values, not just with what's expected of you. And with every act of courage, that old fear begins to lose its grip. There's a kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep can fix. It's not the kind you get from long hours or physical labor. It's the kind that comes from constantly shaping yourself around the comfort of others, from being agreeable when you want to disagree, from staying quiet when your heart is asking to speak, from saying yes when your soul is screaming no. That's the hidden weight of people-pleasing, and it's far heavier than we realize. We stretch ourselves thin, thinking we're being kind, helpful, supportive, but deep down, we're slowly disappearing. Not because others asked us to vanish, but because we didn't know we were allowed to stay. The Buddha spoke clearly about this kind of suffering. He called it dukkha, not just pain, but that subtle, constant unease that arises when we're out of alignment with truth. And one of the deepest truths we often ignore is our right to inner peace. Not the peace that comes when everyone approves of us, but the peace that comes when we approve of ourselves. That kind of peace isn't loud. It doesn't demand applause. It simply arrives the moment we stop making our peace a bargain in exchange for someone else's comfort. It's a strange thing, isn't it? We're taught from a young age that being good means being available, that love looks like sacrifice, that saying no makes you selfish. And so we carry those beliefs into adulthood, into friendships, workplaces, relationships. We answer messages even when we're depleted. We go to events we don't want to attend. We take on responsibilities that don't align with our values, all because we're afraid of letting someone down. But here's the hard truth. The longer we put others' comfort above our own, the more disconnected we become from who we are. And over time, that disconnection doesn't just cause stress. It leads to resentment, burnout, and a deep ache we can't quite explain. The Buddha reminded us that better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. And that word might sometimes be no, or not now, or I need rest. These aren't rejections. They are boundaries, sacred lines that protect the calm we are trying so hard to build. Because the truth is, peace doesn't come from being liked. It comes from being honest, with yourself first, with others second. And here's what's even more powerful. When you start honoring your own peace, something amazing happens. You don't become less compassionate, you become more so. But this time, it comes from a full heart, not a depleted one. You're no longer giving because you're afraid of being rejected. You're giving because you genuinely want to. That shift, it's everything. That's the difference between pleasing and serving. Pleasing drains you, serving fills you. And Buddhism teaches us to act from right intention, one of the core elements of the Eightfold Path. That means acting not out of fear, but from a place of love, clarity, and presence. So what does that look like in real life? It might mean pausing before you say yes to that extra project. It might mean skipping that dinner invite and choosing solitude instead. It might mean speaking a truth that's been living in your chest for too long. It might mean taking a slow breath before responding to someone's expectations and asking yourself, is this coming from love or fear? There's a certain kind of tension that builds when we try to control things we were never meant to control. It starts small, wanting someone to respond a certain way, hoping a situation unfolds exactly how we imagined it. But over time, it becomes exhausting. We start managing people's reactions, predicting outcomes, replaying conversations in our head, and bracing for disappointments that haven't even happened. And it doesn't take long before we're completely drained, not by what's actually happening, but by our resistance to what's out of our hands. The Buddha understood this very deeply. He taught that much of our suffering doesn't come from pain itself. It comes from the clinging and grasping at things we cannot control. In Buddhist teachings, this is called upadana, which means attachment or grasping. When we cling to people acting a certain way, or to outcomes unfolding just how we want, we suffer the moment reality deviates from our expectations. And it almost always does, because people are unpredictable. Life is fluid, nothing stays fixed. The Buddha said, just as a tree that is firmly rooted does not tremble in the wind, so the wise remain unshaken by praise or blame. That strength doesn't come from controlling everything. It comes from focusing on the only thing we truly can, ourselves. Let's talk about where your true power lives. Your thoughts, your actions, your responses. That's your realm. That's your garden. But we often leave our garden untended because we're too busy trying to control the weather. We can't stop the wind, we can't stop the rain, but we can plant wisely, nourish the soil, and prepare ourselves for any season. The Buddha encouraged us to look inward with radical honesty, not to shame ourselves, but to find our center again. Rule your mind or it will rule you, he said. It's not just a quote, it's a practice. Every time you try to control someone else's behavior and instead bring your attention back to your own state of mind, you're choosing that practice. This doesn't mean you stop caring, it means you stop controlling. There's a difference. Caring is rooted in love. Control is rooted in fear. And fear always tightens, it narrows your vision, it steals your peace. But when you shift your focus inward, when you say, how can I respond skillfully, instead of, why are they like this, you widen your view, you become less reactive and more responsive, less agitated and more anchored. That's when people notice something different in you, a stillness, a presence, not because your life is perfect, but because you've stopped trying to force it to be. When things feel chaotic, relationships, work, decisions, the best question you can ask isn't, how do I fix all of this? It's, what's my responsibility here? What part is mine to carry? That one shift in perspective can change everything. It gives you permission to release what isn't yours and take care of what is. In Buddhism, this is part of the Eightfold Path, specifically right effort and right intention. It's the idea that we act from wisdom, not impulse, that we put energy only into what supports our peace, and we stop feeding what fuels our suffering. There's something incredibly freeing about realizing that most people aren't thinking about you as much as you think they are. That sounds harsh at first, but it's not meant to diminish you. It's meant to liberate you. So much of our mental suffering comes from the stories we create in our heads. Stories about how others perceive us, what they must be thinking, whether we've disappointed someone or made a mistake that they'll never forget. But the truth is, most people are just trying to get through their own day, wrestling with their own doubts, chasing their own goals, carrying their own burdens. And that awareness, that can shift everything. The Buddha taught us to walk our own path, not in arrogance, but in clarity. He said, your work is to discover your world, and then with all your heart give yourself to it, not the world others want you to live in, not the expectations handed to you. Your world, the one shaped by your values, your heart, your unique journey. But how can we walk that path when we're constantly adjusting ourselves based on what we imagine others might be thinking? The truth is, we can't. Every time we hold ourselves back because they might judge, or they might laugh, or they might not understand, we trade a piece of our authenticity for a temporary illusion of safety. Think about how much energy we spend worrying about things we can't control, like someone else's opinion, someone else's mood, someone else's approval. It's exhausting. And yet we do it so automatically. You might replay a conversation in your head 20 times, wondering if you said something wrong, while the other person forgot it the moment they walked away. Why? Because just like you, they're caught up in their own world, their own mental loops, their own internal battles, and just like you, they're more focused on themselves than anyone else. That's not selfishness, it's just how the human mind works. In Buddhism, we're taught the value of non-attachment, not just to material things, but to ideas, outcomes, identities, and yes, even to other people's opinions. Non-attachment doesn't mean not caring. It means caring deeply, but not letting what you can't control steal your peace. When we let go of this desperate need to be seen a certain way, something amazing happens. We come home to ourselves. We start living from the inside out, not the outside in. We stop trying to be seen and start trying to be real. There's a beautiful simplicity that shows up when you're no longer performing your life for an imaginary audience. You take deeper breaths. You say what you mean. You stop over-explaining. You wear what feels right to you. You make decisions that align with your heart, not with someone else's script. And over time, that way of living starts to feel like peace. Not because everyone approves, but because you do. Let's be honest, people's opinions change constantly. What they admire today, they might criticize tomorrow. What they criticize today, they might admire a year from now. If your self-worth is tied to that kind of instability, your peace will never last. But if your self-worth is anchored in the stillness within, if you know who you are, even when no one else claps for you, that's a kind of freedom no one can take away. There's a quiet kind of suffering that sneaks into our lives, not because something is terribly wrong, but because we've started measuring our worth with someone else's ruler. You wake up feeling okay, but the moment you scroll through your feed or talk to someone who's doing better, that okay feeling dissolves. Suddenly, you're behind. Suddenly, your joy feels small. And it's not because your life is lacking, it's because you're looking at someone else's highlight reel and comparing it to your behind the scenes. This invisible weight of comparison is something the Buddha warned us about, long before social media ever existed. He taught that attachment is the root of suffering, and comparison is just another form of attachment, clinging to the illusion that our value depends on how we stack up against others. Let's be honest, comparison is exhausting. It turns everything into a competition, even the things that are supposed to bring us peace. You meditate, but someone else seems more spiritual. You work hard, but someone else has more followers, more money, more recognition. And slowly, without realizing it, you stop appreciating what you have. You stop being present. You stop living your life because you're too busy watching someone else's. But here's what Buddhist wisdom invites us to remember. Everyone's path is different. No two people are meant to bloom at the same time, in the same way, or under the same conditions. A lotus doesn't envy the sunflowers. It just rises through the mud slowly, quietly, beautifully in its own time. The Buddha once said, "Health is the greatest gift, contentment the greatest wealth, and faithfulness the best relationship." Notice what he didn't say. He didn't say success is measured by how much you own or how much praise you receive. He pointed us inward, toward health, contentment, and loyalty to our truth. But when we constantly compare, we lose all three. We lose our peace of mind. We become discontent with what we've been given. And we abandon our own values just to chase someone else's version of happiness. That's the trap. That's what pulls us away from the path. Comparison also creates a dangerous illusion that there's only one way to be successful, beautiful, or happy. But Buddhism reminds us that truth is not found in sameness, it's found in uniqueness. Your Dharma, your personal path, will not look like anyone else's, and it's not supposed to. That's what makes it sacred. When you understand that, you stop competing, you stop rushing, you start respecting the rhythm of your own life. And that respect, it's what brings real peace, because you're no longer trying to win at life, you're trying to live it fully and honestly. Think about how much energy comparison takes. It drains your spirit, it hijacks your joy, and worst of all, it blinds you to the beauty of your own journey. But when you shift your focus inward, when you replace comparison with compassion, you begin to heal. You start celebrating progress instead of perfection. You start noticing small joys again, the kind that were always there, waiting for you to look away from the noise. The Buddha encouraged us to practice mudita, the joy we feel for others when they succeed. That's the antidote to envy. When someone else blooms, let it remind you that blooming is possible. Let it inspire you, not deplete you. But always come back to your garden. Always return to your soil, your sunlight, your season. Trust that your time is coming. Trust that you are not behind. You are becoming. There's something exhausting about constantly looking around for approval, waiting for the next compliment, the next like, the next, you did well. And yet most people don't even realize how much of their energy is spent chasing that tiny moment of validation. It starts early, when we're kids. Getting gold stars or hearing good job becomes the way we measure our worth. And then we grow up, but that habit doesn't leave us. It just changes shape. Now it shows up in social media, in career choices, in relationships where we silence ourselves to be accepted. But the Buddha saw through all of this. He taught that real happiness, real stability, doesn't come from what's outside of us. It comes from turning inward and discovering who we really are, independent of praise or criticism. This is where the practice of mindfulness becomes your anchor. When you're constantly looking outward to see how others are responding to you, you miss what's happening within you. Are you proud of the way you handled that conversation? Did that choice align with your values? These are questions that only you can answer, and they matter so much more than how others respond. The Buddha said, "The mind is everything. What you think, you become." If your thoughts are built on a foundation of self-awareness and inner clarity, you'll begin to feel a peace that no amount of outside applause can replace. Let's be real. External validation feels good. It's natural to enjoy recognition, but it becomes dangerous when it turns into the only way you feel worthy. When your self-esteem rises and falls based on someone else's approval, you've given away your power. You've made your happiness conditional. And what happens when the praise stops? What happens when people don't notice your effort, or worse, criticize it? Without inner stability, you'll crumble. But with inner growth, you'll be able to hear both praise and criticism and remain centered through it all. Inner growth isn't loud, it's not flashy, it doesn't usually come with applause, but it's what allows you to sleep peacefully at night, knowing you're living with integrity. Buddhism teaches the concept of right effort and right intention, two parts of the Noble Eightfold Path. These aren't about pleasing others, they're about doing what's true for you, taking action that aligns with your heart, your dharma, your deeper purpose. And when you live from that place, you no longer need to chase validation. You start radiating something else, something quieter but much more powerful: self-respect. Another lesson the Buddha emphasized is the impermanence of all things, anicca. That includes praise. Approval from others is fleeting. One moment you're the hero, the next you're forgotten or criticized. If your self-worth is tied to something so unstable, you will always be on edge. But when your worth is built on values like compassion, presence, and wisdom, no one can take that from you. You become grounded, like a tree with deep roots. No matter how strong the wind, you stay standing. It's also worth noticing that chasing validation can become a distraction from your own healing. When you're constantly looking outward, you're not asking the deeper questions. What matters to me? Where am I hurting? What part of me still needs acceptance from me? Inner growth asks you to slow down and sit with yourself. It's uncomfortable at first, but it's where all true transformation begins. It teaches you that you don't need to perform to be enough. You don't need to be seen to matter. You don't need to be praised to feel whole. You don't need the world's applause to feel worthy. You don't need to explain your peace or prove your growth. The most powerful kind of strength is the one that rises quietly within you, the kind that no one sees but you know is there. Keep choosing your path even if no one claps for it, because the journey back to yourself is the most sacred journey of all. If this message touched something in you, there's another video waiting for you on the screen, one that will take you even deeper. Watch it next and keep walking this path of awareness. And as always, thank you for being a part of Buddhist Journey.